Hello and welcome to Dialogue. It's been 3 years since the UK formally left the European Union on January 31st, 2020. 3 years on, what have been the consequences of that decision? Has the separation well served the interests of the UK, and is it possible the two sides could reunite? To discuss more on the past 3 years since Brexit, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor Iain Begg at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Professor Joav Toker at the American Graduate School in Paris, and later on by Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. Iain, I will start with you. If you look back at the past 3 years since the UK officially departed the European Union, what do you make of the 3 years? Is it a success, or is it a failure, or something in the middle?
It's something in the middle. It's a success in that Boris Johnson's great ambition which was to get Brexit done. He did get done. However, the terms on which Britain now has a relationship with the rest of with the European Union are probably unsatisfactory, and very few of the great promises of Brexit have been realised. There have not been massive new trade deals. The great bulk of British legislation which depended on the EU is still on the statute book, and there are many voters who are now saying, did we vote the right way? Because for all that there were promises of taking back control, there doesn't seem to have been much taking back of control, especially in the area of migration. The paradox of Brexit is that the number of net migrants coming into the UK prior to Brexit was under 300,000. Today it's more like 500,000.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are something that can be called successful, and others probably not that successful. Professor Toker, as someone who lives in the country as a EU member, now, if you look back at the past 3 years, what do you make of it?
Well, I would be perhaps more severe than my colleague. I honestly do not consider these 3 years to prove real success, and not even half of the way. Well, you may consider success on British internal politics grounds the fact that Boris Johnson, indeed, at the time, committed himself to this adventure, they used to call it in most European continental capitals at the time, about leaving the EU, about Brexit. And indeed, he succeeded in delivering the results of the referendum, the majority vote in Great Britain, and later on the Brexit per Brexit. Is this, however, to be considered as a success? I honestly do not think so. I'm taking a look at the elements which are coming out in terms of the state of the health of the British economy, and honestly, without trying to be more too patent on it, I don't see too many positive elements there. And when I look at the continental, through a continental point of view at these 3 years, they weren't revolutionary. There weren't difficulties and changes and modifications which were supposed or were predicted to be more violent than they were. True enough, so many other things happened over these 3 years, the COVID and now the war in Ukraine, and things which had violently intervened with both economic and political and mental scenes. So it's a bit difficult to see what the Brexit, in which way did Brexit per se contributed to these modifications. But I wouldn't call that a success, no.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Iain Begg, obviously, as Professor Joav Toker talked about, it's not only one factor, the Brexit, for example, over the past 3 years, we have this pandemic, basically global. It's a global issue. And of course, last year, basically a year ago, you have this Ukraine crisis. And it all affects the health of the state, the health of the economy. So, I mean, it's very hard probably to distinguish, what kind of a role Brexit has played positively or negatively to the health of the state.
Yes, you're exactly right. The last 3 years have been dramatic for other reasons, and it's masked the economic impact of Brexit, because if we look across Europe, every country in the European Union, plus the UK, had a significant downturn in the economy in the first part of 2020. Most of them then recovered later in the year or in 2021, and now they're stagnating because of the combination of the effects of high gas prices, the impact that's had on inflation, and the shortage of demand coming from certain parts of the world. Now, it's worth taking a step back and saying, what were people predicting would happen as a result of Brexit, given that it's all masked by these subsequent developments? There were some, particularly on the Remain side of the debate in the UK, who thought that the effect of Brexit would be very dramatic. There'd be a rapid rise in unemployment, there would be a disinvestment by foreign direct investors, and there would be some catastrophes in the economy. Broadly speaking, that has not happened. And it's important to put on the record that the effects of Brexit have been muted. They've been incremental and relatively small, but we wait to see what the eventual effects will be, because they could continue to be incremental and small, but taking us downwards. And the sort of thing that causes that is the fact that what's happened in analytic terms as a result of Brexit is the reimposition of non-tariff barriers to trade. These had all been swept away by what's called the European single market, something the Brits were very keen on back in the 1980s. And now these non-tariff barriers are back in place, and they cause trade friction, which is the principal source of negative impact for the British economy.
That's right. Basically of the same nature, I guess. Hongjian, I know the Chinese government was not really keen to see, the UK's departure from the European Union. China used to, at least, love to invest in the UK, and then from UK to the European continent to do business is easier, I guess. And of course, UK played a very important role. Now, 3 years, has been gone, and how do China see the Brexit or departure from the European Union by the UK?
Absolutely, yes. From China's perspective, it's not a, welcome event for this Brexit, especially as we know for most of the Chinese companies and investors. They try to regard the UK and the European continent as a single market. But now I think that after 3 years, for most of the Chinese companies and investors, they have to be familiar with this, some huge changes because of Brexit. For example, especially for those financial sectors, also some bankers, they have to try to, to keep a balance between these two important markets. In the European continent and also the UK. And also on other regard is, as we know, usually the UK has been regarded as an economy to insist more opening, market and also freedom of investment within the European Union. But now, as we find that once there is a Brexit, certainly there will be more and more conservative force within the European Union, especially represented by some countries from like France or some other. So anyway, I think it's not so good message or so good result for China to have to deal with the departure of the UK and to redesign. Especially for most of the Chinese investors, redesign the plan or strategy of investment in Europe.
Well, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on Monday defended Brexit, insisting that leaving the EU had brought significant achievements and offered a huge opportunity. Professor Toker, you agree with him, or is that mostly about political talk?
No, unfortunately, I would not agree with him, but I'm not surprised by this kind of declaration, reminding us that Britain had had 4 prime ministers over the last 3.5 years, They were all conservatives, and that was a conservative, more or less conservative platform when the British were called to the polls to vote on Brexit. So it would be awkward for the conservative present Prime Minister to admit this early, if you wish, in the post-Brexit era, that things have failed, and he should do that. I mean, that's not the role of a leader to point excessively at negative points. But the data coming up, just a few hours ago, there were new elements coming up describing the British economy as the weakest, not only amongst the 7th largest world economy, the so-called G7, but even in the framework of the 15 to 20 largest economies on earth, the British are performing in the worst way. It could be explained, of course, but the reasons just add up to illustrate why things in terms of positive anticipation are seemingly rather far-fetched. When you have that level of inflation, almost 10%, that level of interest rates, and other difficulties, and when you have the vision of global Britain, remember global Britain of Boris Johnson, making Britain some kind of huge Singapore-type growth and success and future technologies thing, I'm afraid that the British Isles are still far away from that vision.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is not, as taking place as expected, probably. We will talk more about that. But before that, there's opinion polls show that Britons who regret leaving the EU increasingly outnumber those who do not. So, Professor Iain Begg, tell us, as an individual, I guess you used to live in London, but of course you traveled to the European continent. In what way, the Brexit may affect your personal life or lifestyle?
Well, there are small things. My new passport, which I obtained after Brexit, which was back to the nice British blue, was
sovereignty.
New in 2020, and already it's nearly 3/4 full of stamps, because every time I go into or out of the European Union, I have to be stamped in and stamped out. So this is an irritation if you're traveling. There's also, for many people, the concern, I'm in the university sector, that Britain's membership of the EU research programs is still in doubt. It was supposed to have been settled by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but because the way Boris Johnson and his team negotiated the deal between the UK and the EU was incomplete, that big area of collaboration on research is suspended. And that's damaging both to British universities and to continental European universities, because in the past we were very keen to have British participation in research groups, research initiatives. So there are these maybe trivial things that affect individuals, affect our sector. There's also the concern, if you widen it a bit, from the companies, that many small company exporters say the paperwork is just now too great for us, and we no longer are going to export to the EU. So it's all these little things that add up to a negative impact, rather than one great big bang that says it's been either a catastrophe or a success.
Mm-hmm. Professor Iain Begg, a new poll by Ipsos, which conducted 3 years on since Britain formally left the European Union, finds 45% of the Britons think that Brexit is going worse than they expected. That's up from 28% in June 2021. If that's the case, is it about the execution of the Brexit, the process, which is not going very well, or is it a reflection of people's, sentiment? Probably not being happy with their individual conditions, or?
It's a combination of those things. There were subsequent promises by Boris Johnson to what he called level up the economy. The people who voted for Brexit were concentrated in the middle and north of England. They were not in Scotland, where I come from. They were not in London, where I work. They were in this middle and north of England, which are relatively less prosperous parts of the country. The promise there was that the combination of Brexit and the new liberties that the UK would gain would enable Boris Johnson and subsequent prime ministers to improve their standing. And they recognise that very little has happened. The transport system in the north of England, for example, is disastrous. You cannot get from Liverpool to Hull on the east coast without a strong threat of cancellation of your train. So that agenda, subsequent to Brexit, has not been delivered. And this is causing disaffection amongst those same voters who now think, well, Brexit was the promise, levelling up was supposed to be the later promise. Does that mean Brexit is to blame for the absence of levelling up? So this sentiment is building on itself. Now, I would say one thing in response to all this, that opinion polls are dangerous, because you ask a question like this and people answer on the spur of the moment. If they were to face a new referendum, I'd still be quite suspicious that the change in mind would reflect itself in a new referendum result.
That's true. I mean, opinion polls, they change on daily basis, sometimes. Professor Toker, you mentioned about, global Britain. That's one of the talking point for the, I think, Boris government. Once we leave the European Union, we can go global and have a better future, basically. But of course, we also understand that basically leaving the European Union means it's like, rebuilding barrier with the largest trading partner, and you want to open new market in the US, in Europe, in Asia, for example, second largest economy, China. But why we are not seeing that happening, for example, a trade agreement with Washington?
Well, that's indeed one of the fronts on which the vision, the anticipation, the optimistic design of what's going to be with Britain after Brexit actually, if not failed, at least did not deliver to the amount and the account the British supporters of Brexit believe it may. For many reasons which I believe are more perhaps due to the American, the US side of the equation than the British one. But anyway, Britain was the minor partner in such a vision of US, British, very strong, very powerful, very successful new alliance or renewed alliance. And as Britain remains obviously the minor partner in this couple, then of course what happens in America, politically speaking, economically speaking, of course, is more important in terms of the chances of such an alliance to become stronger. The same goes with other potential partners. Look at the Commonwealth, for example, in which the British, and according to Johnson's vision, had so many opportunities. I don't see them coming into reality. And of course, stays the major commercial partner of Britain of before Brexit days, namely the EU, the continent. My distinguished colleague described the fact that he has so many stamps now accumulated in his passport. Well, okay, I don't believe that's too much of a burden, but imagine what it means, the equivalent thing means for businesses, for enterprises, for companies which have to cross the border from the British Isles into continental Europe. Now, there are no tariffs, but you have your custom officers there at the end of the line for both human beings and merchandise. And bureaucratically speaking, that has slowed down the movement and, of course, stopped much of the potential of extra growth, which could have been achieved if there were only the economic factors playing their role and not the bureaucratic ones. So, sorry, not yet the end of the tunnel in sight.
Well, Hongjian, of course, one part of the vision is to increase trade and investment with Asian countries, for example, China, Japan, and also the CPTPP, basically the partnership, across the Pacific Partnership, 10 countries now. So there's a lot of potential. I mean, people understand, trade is by nature mutually beneficial. Of course, investors, people love this free flow of personnel, free flow of free movement, for example, investment in the capital, that's again benefits both sides or all sides. How about the progress on that front?
Yes, as we know that even on the regard of the trade relations between the UK and this region, I mean Asia and the Pacific, certainly there are a lot of potential, especially between China and the UK. We can find out even in the COVID-19, even in the nowadays situation, certainly there are also a big increase of bilateral trade. And also now, UK try to have some more connectivity and trade with these regional countries in Asia and the Pacific. But now I think that there is also some more challenges for the UK to try to promote its relations with regional countries in Asia and the Pacific. One of the biggest challenges is how about the UK government is to manage the more and more uncertainties produced by the Brexit. Frankly, because of Brexit, the UK as a market has a less and less attraction for other economies, including China. And also at the same time, especially recent years, because of some change of policy and the narrative, now it looks like the Conservative government in the UK try to have some more recognition of its interests with some more precondition as the value or political intervention into the trade areas. So I think that once there are some more political interference from the UK government, from the House, I am afraid that this potential will also get a lot of negative impact.
Also politics there. Professor Iain Begg, if you look at the domestic politics in the UK, of course, the finance minister, Jeremy Hunt, has called to stop the declinist talk and says Britain's growth plans are energized and made possible by Brexit. So let's look into the future, look at the prospect of the economy or the state of the country. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? How bright is tomorrow, let's say, for the UK? We know not long ago this big challenge, recession, economy, protests, for example, inflation. There are a lot of challenges. But what are the government doing? Different departments doing to resolve the issue and try to bring a better future for the country?
Well, the first thing to say is that Brexit, dating back even before the referendum in 2016, was very much an internal Conservative Party problem. The Conservative Party was trying to find a way to mollify those on its right wing who were saying we don't like the European Union, while trying to address the economic problems that Britain's faced. And that struggle has been part of the explanation for having so many prime ministers in such a short period of time. Now, that said, what Jeremy Hunt is now trying to do was first to stabilise the economy after the disastrous 7 weeks of Liz Truss as Prime Minister when things went badly wrong. He succeeded in that. His next priority is to curb inflation. He's starting to succeed in that. But the real challenge for the British economy is going to be to start to work far more effectively on the growth agenda, and that means first dealing with the low productivity growth in the British economy, which also dates back more than 10 years. That's going to be lead to an innovation emphasis in the economic policy. He's betting on that, and I think he's correct to try to bet on that, but it's going to be a slow process. And although Brexit has not helped, there is one relatively positive thing to take out of Brexit, which is that foreign direct investment into the UK economy is still strong. It's the second biggest destination now after France, having been the first before Brexit, but it's still much bigger than Germany or Italy or any of the other substantial economies in Europe. So there are good signs there. There's the possibility of changing regulation to be more business friendly, which is part of the Brexit agenda. It hasn't really happened yet, but it is going to be next on the agenda once he deals with inflation. So for Jeremy Hunt, it's inflation first, then try to deal with the growth challenges, and particularly to boost productivity.
Well, stabilize the economy and unleash the potential. Professor Toker, if you look at the opinions by the people, according to a recent poll by the British press, The Independent, nearly 2/3 of the Britons now support a fresh referendum to rejoin the EU, and 1/5 of those want it to be done immediately. How likely the UK becoming part of the EU again? And another related question, if people are not happy with the popular vote in 2016, how can they be sure that it will be right this time around? This sense or this element of populism, do you see a problem in there probably?
I don't know whether problem is the right term, but
that's true.
Obviously, the immediate results of such polls cannot commit politicians or observers to harsh, solid, deep conclusions. Just the vision or a possible scenario of the British trying to go back, to reverse Brexit, and knocking at the doors of the European Union, asking nicely Brussels and the French and the German and the Italians and the Belgian to accept them back, is politically and economically far-reaching. Not to speak about the internal British fallout of that, and not to speak about the fact that we shouldn't forget that inside Great Britain we have the problem in Scotland, and in Wales to some extent, in which there's a clear majority, and there's always been a clear majority in favor of Remain. So you see, there's too many tensions on both sides of the British Channel, and if at any time in the future this would become serious, I mean the ambition of the British or the wish of the British to go back and become the 28th member of the EU, it would be a long, tiring and complicated procedure, and I wonder if it is realistic to predict on that even in the medium and long run.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hongjian, briefly, some people would say, the departure of Brexit is sort of like a sign of deglobalization. Somehow people saying we are staying together for too long, we want to be on our own. But now people probably realize that it's good to stay together and to have a globalized world. Everybody benefits from that kind of free movement of goods and the personnel.
Yes, I think that the time always will give some more lessons to people who have some choice before. But now I think just 3 or 2 years is not enough for most of British people to understand what's the real situation. But I think now it's time for not only for the people in the UK and for the people in all of the countries and economies to realize the value of globalization. And even now, as we know, there are more barriers than before for the globalization. But certainly, I believe that still there are a lot of potential for a more healthy and also more sustainable globalization ahead.
More trade and more investment. Well, on that note, we conclude today's show, and many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.